Millionaire hires a single mother to pretend to be his wife, but what he didn't expect was the truth she carried, a secret that would change everything. Before the start of the story, comment below, where are you watching this video from? Please enjoy the story. Ethan Weston was the kind of man whose presence demanded attention. He wasn't just wealthy, he was a symbol of success, power, and untouchable confidence. At 35, he was already at the helm of a multi-million-dollar tech empire, the kind of mogul whose name graced Forbes lists and business headlines. But behind the tailored suits and polished smile was a man who had built walls so high, even he couldn't see over them. Relationships were a distraction, emotions were weaknesses, and his image was everything. On the other side of the city, in a modest two-bedroom apartment, Grace Harper was leading a very different life. Her days began at the crack of dawn, juggling her job as a waitress at a busy downtown diner and caring for her 6-year-old son, Liam. Every step she took was for him, from the double shifts to the sleepless nights spent helping him with school projects. Her life was a delicate balance of resilience and exhaustion. For Ethan, life was a game, and he always played to win. But this time, the stakes were personal. His company was finalizing a merger that would elevate him to a whole new level, but there was a catch. "Ethan, you need to show them stability," his business partner Gerald had said over a tense breakfast meeting. "These people don't just invest in numbers, they invest in trust. A married man projects stability and commitment. It's what they want to see." Grace had learned long ago not to depend on anyone. Her ex-husband had left when Liam was just a baby, disappearing without a trace. The betrayal had left her cautious, guarded, and fiercely independent. Yet, despite the challenges, she refused to let life break her. "We're a team," she'd often say to Liam, ruffling his hair as they tackled another tough day together. Ethan had scoffed at the idea. Marriage? He barely had time for coffee, let alone a relationship. But the pressure mounted. "Just find someone," Gerald had insisted. "Someone who fits the part. Make it temporary if you have to, but make it believable." For Ethan, it wasn't about love, it was about strategy. And so, the hunt for the perfect temporary wife began. One afternoon, as Grace wiped down tables during the lunch rush, she overheard two customers talking about a high-profile gala. It was the kind of event where the rich and powerful mingled, where fortunes were made with a handshake. She barely paid attention. Those kinds of lives were worlds away from hers. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Ethan first saw Grace at the cafe by accident, or so it seemed. He was there, scanning the room for someone, anyone, who might fit the role he needed. He wasn't looking for perfection, he was looking for authenticity. And there she was, sitting at the counter with a tired yet determined look in her eyes, balancing a notebook and a coffee cup while glancing at her phone. Ethan approached her with the air of someone used to getting what he wanted. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and measured. Grace looked up, momentarily startled. "I couldn't help but notice you seem busy. Would you mind if I joined you for a moment?" Grace blinked, confused but too polite to refuse. Sure," she replied cautiously, setting her notebook aside. What followed was a conversation unlike any Ethan had ever had. Grace was sharp, direct, and unflinchingly honest. When Ethan explained his proposition, pretend to be his wife for one night at a gala, her reaction was a mixture of shock and suspicion. "You want me to lie?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "For what? To impress a room full of people you don't even like?" Ethan smirked, impressed by her bluntness. "Not lie. Perform. There's a difference. And you'd be compensated generously for your time." Grace leaned back, arms crossed, weighing her options. She could see through his polished exterior. This was a man used to buying his way out of problems. But for her, this was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. The money he offered could cover Liam's school fees, pay off the overdue rent, and give her a small cushion for emergencies. Still, Grace wasn't someone to jump into things blindly. "I'll think about it," she said, standing up. "But don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you. If I agree, it's because I need the money, not because I care about your image or your problems." Ethan watched her leave, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. She was different from anyone he'd ever met. Strong-willed, unyielding, and entirely unimpressed by his wealth. This was going to be more challenging and more interesting than he'd anticipated. Ethan Weston wasn't used to hearing the word no. In his world, problems were solved with charm, money, or sheer determination. But when he approached Grace Harper with his unconventional proposal, he was met with an unexpected resistance. Sitting across from her in the same cafe where he had first spotted her, Ethan laid out his plan with calculated precision. "I need someone to attend an event with me," he began, his voice smooth and professional. "Not just anyone. A woman who can carry herself with confidence, someone who looks grounded." Grace raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Grounded? That's a new one. Is that just your way of saying I'm not your usual type?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Not exactly," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "I need someone who feels authentic, someone who doesn't come across as fake. It's a temporary arrangement, one night, and the compensation is substantial." Grace leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she studied him. She had dealt with smooth talkers before, people who thought they could buy their way into or out of anything. Ethan might have been wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, but she wasn't going to be swayed so easily. "Let me get this straight," Grace said, her tone sharp. "You want me to pretend to be your wife for one night? Smile, play nice, and lie to a room full of strangers so you can close some big business deal?" Ethan's expression remained calm, though her words stung more than he expected. "It's not about lying," he explained. "It's about presenting an image that people trust. Stability, reliability, it's what investors value." Grace couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in her voice. "And you think hiring a random single mother is going to make you look stable?" Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I think hiring you is the smartest move I can make right now. You're real, Grace. You're not trying to impress anyone, and that's exactly what makes you perfect for this. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I just need you to play a part." For a moment, Grace said nothing. She was torn between disbelief and curiosity. The idea was absurd, but the offer was tempting. A single night of work, no strings attached, and the kind of money that could solve so many of her problems. "And how much are we talking?" she asked cautiously. Ethan named a figure that made Grace's heart skip a beat. It was more money than she'd made in the past year, and it could change everything for her and Liam. Still, she hesitated. "I have a son," she said finally, her voice firm. "He's my priority. I'm not going to do anything that puts him in a bad position." Ethan nodded, respecting her resolve. "This arrangement won't affect your son in any way. It's just one night, Grace. After that, you're free to walk away." But Grace wasn't done. "There are conditions," she said, leaning forward now. "I set the boundaries and you respect them. No controlling, no manipulation, and definitely no funny business." Ethan couldn't help but smile. She was sharp, no doubt about it. "Agreed," he said without hesitation. Grace studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of dishonesty. Finally, she let out a deep breath and nodded. "Fine. I'll do it. But don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you. I'm doing it for my son." Ethan extended his hand across the table, his expression unreadable. "Then we have a deal." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Ethan insisted on running through every detail, from their "It's How We Met" story to the kinds of questions they might be asked at the event. People will be curious, he explained as they sat in his spacious office overlooking the city. They'll want to know everything about you, where you're from, what you do, how we fell in love. Grace rolled her eyes. Fell in love? You're really laying it on thick. It has to be convincing, Ethan replied, unbothered by her sarcasm. If anyone suspects this isn't real, the whole thing falls apart. Grace sighed, already regretting her decision. Fine. Let's get this over with. Despite her reluctance, Grace couldn't deny that Ethan was meticulous. He went over every possible scenario, every potential question. His attention to detail was impressive, even if it bordered on obsessive. But it wasn't just Ethan who had to adapt. Grace found herself learning things she'd never imagined: how to navigate high society conversations, how to walk in heels that felt like torture devices, and how to fake a smile that didn't make her feel like a fraud. You'll be fine, Ethan reassured her during one particularly grueling practice session. You're a natural. Grace shot him a look. Don't patronize me, Weston. This is your world, not mine. Ethan's expression softened. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of vulnerability beneath Grace's tough exterior. You're right, he admitted. But you're stronger than you think. That's why I chose you. As the day of the gala approached, the tension between them grew. Ethan was used to control, precision, and perfection. Grace, on the other hand, was fiercely independent and unwilling to be molded into someone she wasn't. Stop trying to turn me into one of your designer accessories, she snapped during a heated argument over her wardrobe. If you wanted a trophy wife, you should have picked someone else. Ethan held up his hands in surrender. I'm not trying to change you, Grace. I just want us to look coordinated. Well, this is as coordinated as I'm going to get, she shot back, crossing her arms. Despite their clashes, there was an undeniable tension between them, one that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Ethan found himself drawn to Grace's strength and honesty, while Grace couldn't help but notice the rare moments of vulnerability behind Ethan's polished exterior. The night before the gala, Ethan and Grace sat in his penthouse, reviewing their story one last time. Let's go over this again, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. We met at a charity event 6 months ago. You were volunteering. I was donating. Grace groaned. Do we really have to rehearse this again? I've got it memorized. Ethan arched an eyebrow. I'd rather you be over-prepared than under-prepared. Grace leaned back on the couch, exhausted but unable to argue. Fine. But if anyone asks how we fell in love, I'm just going to say you bribed me with coffee. Ethan chuckled, the sound surprising them both. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by something lighter. Tomorrow's going to be intense, he said after a pause. Are you ready? Grace met his gaze, her expression steady. I've handled worse. As they parted ways for the night, neither of them could have predicted how much that one event would change everything. What began as a deal was about to become something far more complicated and far more meaningful. The day of the gala arrived, and Ethan Weston's meticulously controlled world was about to meet Grace Harper's unapologetic authenticity. From the moment Grace stepped into the sleek black car Ethan had sent to pick her up, it was clear they came from different planets. She sat in silence, clutching her small handbag tightly, as the city skyline blurred past the tinted windows. Across from her, Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, every movement precise and deliberate, exuding the kind of confidence that only came from a life lived at the top. Relax, Ethan said, breaking the silence, though his tone carried more command than comfort. You look perfect. Grace's eyes narrowed, her tone sharp. Perfect for what? Lying to a room full of strangers? Ethan smirked but didn't reply. He wasn't used to being challenged, and part of him found Grace's defiance both infuriating and intriguing. She wasn't like the polished, agreeable women he usually surrounded himself with. Grace was real, and tonight, that was exactly what he needed her to be. The gala was being held in one of the city's most luxurious hotels, a glittering venue filled with chandeliers, champagne, and the soft hum of an orchestra. As Ethan and Grace entered arm in arm, the room seemed to pause. Heads turned, whispers began, and cameras flashed. Ethan Weston was always the center of attention, but tonight, it was Grace who drew the stares. She wore a simple yet elegant dress Ethan had insisted she wear, and despite her discomfort, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her expression was calm, but inside, she felt like a fish out of water. This wasn't her world, and every step reminded her of just how far she was from the life she knew. "You're doing great," Ethan whispered as they moved through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on her back. "Don't patronize me," Grace shot back, her voice low but firm. Ethan suppressed a grin. Even here, surrounded by billionaires and power players, Grace was unshakable. As the night progressed, Grace began to notice something surprising. These people, with all their wealth and status, weren't as intimidating as she'd expected. Many of them were more curious about her than critical. They asked questions: how she and Ethan met, what drew them to each other, and Grace found herself slipping into the role more easily than she'd anticipated. It was his persistence, Grace said with a small smile when one of Ethan's business partners asked about their love story. He wouldn't take no for an answer. Ethan glanced at her, startled by how natural she sounded. "And your honesty," he added, improvising. "You see the world in a way I never could." For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. It was fleeting, quickly buried under the weight of the arrangement, but it was there. Grace's authenticity began to win over even the toughest skeptics. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that made her stand out in a room full of people who were. Her wit and straightforwardness disarmed them, and before long, she was at the center of conversations that Ethan had assumed he'd have to lead. "I like her," one investor said to Ethan, nodding toward Grace. "She's different. Grounded. You're a lucky man, Weston." Ethan forced a polite smile, but inside, he was conflicted. Grace was doing her job, and doing it well, but it wasn't just the investors she was winning over. She was winning him over, too. While Grace was thriving in the spotlight, Ethan found himself watching her more closely than he'd intended. She laughed easily, spoke with conviction, and seemed completely at ease despite being in a world so far removed from her own. But then there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he caught a shadow in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper. It was in the way she glanced at her phone when she thought no one was looking, or how her smile faltered when someone mentioned family. Ethan's curiosity grew. He'd chosen Grace for her strength, but now he wondered what she was hiding beneath it. Later in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the music softened, Ethan found Grace standing by one of the grand windows, gazing out at the city lights. Her expression was distant, almost wistful. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan asked, approaching her. Grace turned, startled, but quickly recovered. "Just taking a breather. These heels are killing me." Ethan chuckled, though he wasn't convinced. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Better than I expected." "Don't sound so surprised," Grace replied, her voice laced with sarcasm. Ethan smiled, but his gaze remained steady. "You know, you're more than what you let on, Grace. You surprised a lot of people tonight, including me." Grace hesitated, her guard briefly slipping. "You don't know me, Ethan." "Not really. And I'm not sure you want to." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ethan wanted to press her, to ask what she meant, but the moment passed too quickly. Grace straightened, her expression hardening. "Anyway, I think I've done my job for the night. Time to call it a success." As they left the gala, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Grace was much more than the role she'd agreed to play. He had expected her to fit neatly into his plan, but instead, she had disrupted it in the best possible way. The car ride back was quiet, the city lights casting shifting shadows across their faces. For once, Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to silence, but something about Grace made him feel it was okay not to fill the space with words. When they arrived at Grace's apartment, she hesitated before stepping out. "Thanks for the ride," she said finally, her voice softer than usual. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her as she disappeared into the building. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name. An ache, a curiosity, a pull toward someone who saw the world so differently from him. The morning after the gala, Ethan found himself distracted. His mind kept drifting back to Grace, her smile, her strength, the way she carried herself with such quiet confidence. He tried to focus on work, but every phone call, every meeting felt hollow. Meanwhile, Grace was back to her usual routine, dropping Liam off at school and heading to the diner for her shift. The gala felt like a strange dream, a brief detour into a world she didn't belong to. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget the way Ethan had looked at her, the genuine admiration in his eyes, the softness in his voice when he spoke to her. Their arrangement was supposed to end with the gala, but it didn't. Ethan found excuses to call Grace, asking for her opinion on trivial matters or offering updates on the success of the event. Grace, though wary, couldn't deny that she enjoyed their conversations. What had started as a business deal was slowly turning into something more. Ethan began to see Grace not as a means to an end, but as a person, someone who challenged him, intrigued him, and made him question his carefully constructed life. And Grace, despite her better judgment, found herself letting down her guard. Ethan was different from the men she'd known, arrogant, yes, but also kind in ways she hadn't expected. Neither of them could admit it yet, but the lines between their worlds were beginning to blur. What had started as an arrangement was becoming something far more complicated and far more real. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of wealth and power, illuminated by glittering chandeliers that cast golden reflections across the marble floor. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their laughter and polished conversation filling the room. Ethan Weston stepped through the arched entrance with Grace Harper at his side, her hand lightly resting on his arm. Grace had imagined this moment repeatedly during the awkward rehearsals with Ethan. She had dreaded it, even resented it, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer magnitude of the spectacle. The room buzzed with life, a parade of success and privilege, a world far removed from her own. For a brief moment, she felt as though every eye in the room was fixed on her. "Breathe," Ethan whispered, leaning slightly toward her without breaking his poised demeanor. "I am breathing," Grace replied under her breath, masking her nerves with a sharp tone. "Then try smiling. You look like you're walking into a courtroom," he quipped, his smirk just visible. Grace forced a small smile, though she shot him a sidelong glare. "I'm here, aren't I? Just don't expect me to start curtsying to your investor friends." Ethan suppressed a laugh, hiding it behind a polite nod to a passing guest. "Fair enough. Just remember, authenticity is your strength. Use it." As they moved deeper into the room, conversations paused and heads turned. Ethan Weston was no stranger to attention, but tonight, the murmurs weren't about him, they were about Grace. "Who's she?" one woman whispered behind a gloved hand. "Weston's wife, apparently," replied another, her tone thick with intrigue. Grace could feel the weight of their stares, the subtle judgment and curiosity. But she squared her shoulders, reminding herself that this was just another role to play. If these people wanted a show, she would give them one. Their first stop was the circle of Ethan's business partners, a group of men who exuded power and entitlement. Gerald, Ethan's closest confidant, greeted them with a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile. "So this is the elusive Mrs. Weston," Gerald said, extending his hand to Grace. "Ethan's been keeping you hidden?" Grace shook his hand firmly, her confidence beginning to build. "Not hidden, just busy," she replied, her tone cool and composed. Ethan's lips twitched with amusement. Grace was holding her own, just as he'd hoped. The night progressed with a blur of introductions, handshakes, and polite exchanges. Grace was beginning to find her rhythm, even enjoying the challenge of fitting into a world that was so alien to her. She wasn't intimidated by the wealth or the status. If anything, she found it amusing how much these people cared about appearances. "Mrs. Weston, how did you and Ethan meet?" asked one of the women, her tone as sweet as her diamond-encrusted necklace was expensive. Grace shot Ethan a quick glance, silently daring him to jump in. But he didn't. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, leaving the story to her. At a charity event, Grace began smoothly, recalling the rehearsed story. "I was volunteering. He was donating." Typical Ethan, sweeping in to save the day. The group chuckled, clearly charmed by her wit. Ethan, too, couldn't help but smile. "And what was your first impression of him?" the woman pressed. Grace hesitated, then decided to stray slightly from the script. "Honestly, I thought he was arrogant. Handsome, sure, but a little too sure of himself." The group erupted in laughter, and Ethan's smile widened, though he leaned closer to whisper, "Arrogant? Really?" Grace turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Well, you did ask me to be authentic." As the evening wore on, Grace began to relax, the initial tension fading. She even managed to enjoy herself, surprising even Ethan. But as the night reached its midpoint, something shifted. A man from the crowd approached them, his face unfamiliar to Grace but clearly known to Ethan. He was older, with a commanding presence and an air of disdain that set Grace on edge. "Ethan," the man greeted coldly, his gaze flickering briefly to Grace before returning to Ethan. "I see you've brought company tonight. Finally settled down, have you?" Ethan's jaw tightened, though his smile remained intact. "This is Grace, my wife," he said evenly. The man's smile was sharp, almost predatory. How quaint. Grace felt the sting of his dismissal, but before she could respond, Ethan's hand lightly touched her back, a subtle gesture of reassurance. The man turned back to Ethan, launching into a conversation about business deals and old grudges. Grace, though silent, could sense the tension between them. It was the first time she had seen Ethan rattled, even slightly, and it unsettled her. When the man finally left, Grace turned to Ethan. "Who was that?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze distant. "No one important." Grace frowned, unconvinced. "He didn't seem like no one." Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening. "It's just business, Grace. Let's not let it ruin the night." But the moment lingered, a crack in Ethan's otherwise impenetrable facade. Later, as the gala wound down, Ethan led Grace to a quieter corner of the ballroom. The hum of conversation faded into the background, and for the first time that night, they were alone. "You surprised me tonight," Ethan admitted, his tone unusually sincere. Grace raised an eyebrow. "By not embarrassing you?" "No," he replied, his lips curving into a small smile. "By being exactly who you are. You didn't just fit in, you stood out. In a good way." Grace studied him, trying to decipher the sudden shift in his demeanor. "Why does that matter so much to you?" Ethan's smile faltered, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. "Because I've spent my entire life trying to control everything, how people see me, what they think of me. But tonight, you reminded me that maybe there's more to life than appearances." Grace blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. She wasn't sure how to respond, so she didn't. The car ride back to Grace's apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. The tension that had hung between them earlier had softened, replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. As the car pulled up to her building, Grace hesitated before stepping out. "Well," she said, her tone light but her expression serious, "I guess tonight was a success." "It was," Ethan agreed, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. Grace opened the car door but paused before getting out. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Grace," he replied, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. As she disappeared into the building, Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring out the window. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. An ache, a pull, a longing for someone who saw through his carefully constructed facade. And for Grace, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had been more than just a job. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. The days following the gala were a mix of reflection and confusion for both Ethan and Grace. What had been meant as a simple, transactional arrangement had started to take on a life of its own. Ethan found himself thinking about Grace more often than he cared to admit. Her confidence, her resilience, the way she had navigated his world with an authenticity that no one else had ever dared to show. And Grace, despite her resolve to keep her walls up, couldn't deny the subtle shift in her perception of Ethan. Their interactions began to change. What were once stiff, businesslike exchanges had softened, revealing glimpses of vulnerability on both sides. Ethan, usually reserved and guarded, found himself asking Grace about her life, her struggles, her dreams, and, most importantly, her son. Grace, surprised by his genuine interest, reluctantly began to open up, though she remained wary of letting him in too far. It happened one evening when Ethan, uncharacteristically, asked to meet Grace outside of their usual settings. They sat on a park bench as the sun set, the vibrant colors of the sky casting a warm glow over the city. Ethan had suggested the location, hoping to make the meeting feel less formal. So, Ethan began, breaking the silence. "You've told me bits and pieces about your life, but I'd like to know more." Grace raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "But this isn't part of our deal." Ethan shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because I'm curious. Because I want to understand you." Grace hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something about the sincerity in Ethan's voice made her relent. She spoke hesitantly at first, recounting her early struggles as a single mother, the sleepless nights, the endless worries about bills, and the heartbreak of Liam's father walking away. "I've had to be both mom and dad," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "It's not easy, but Liam makes it worth it. He's my whole world." Ethan listened intently, his usual calculating demeanor replaced with genuine empathy. He had always viewed Grace as strong, but hearing the details of her story deepened his admiration for her. "You've done an incredible job," Ethan said softly. "Liam's lucky to have you." Grace glanced at him, her defenses momentarily lowering. "Thanks. But I don't need compliments, Ethan. I need stability, for him, for me. That's what I'm fighting for." Ethan nodded, understanding the unspoken challenge in her words. Grace's world was built on survival and sacrifice, and he knew he couldn't offer her anything less than respect for that. After their conversation, Ethan began to reflect on his own life. He had spent years chasing success, building an empire, and cultivating an image that screamed perfection. But sitting across from Grace, hearing her talk about the things that truly mattered, he couldn't help but feel a gnawing emptiness. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights, Ethan felt a restlessness he couldn't shake. For so long, he had believed that control was the key to success, that vulnerability was a weakness to be avoided at all costs. But Grace was showing him a different way, a way that demanded honesty and authenticity, things he had long buried beneath his carefully crafted exterior. The turning point came when Ethan, for the first time, expressed an interest in meeting Liam. Grace was hesitant. This was her son, her most precious treasure, and she wasn't sure she wanted Ethan anywhere near him. But after much persuasion and Ethan's repeated assurances that he only wanted to understand her life better, she agreed. They met at a small park near Grace's apartment. Liam, a bright-eyed 6-year-old with an infectious energy, was immediately curious about Ethan. "Are you my mom's boss?" Liam asked bluntly, tilting his head as he studied Ethan. Ethan chuckled, crouching down to Liam's level. "Something like that. But tonight, I'm just your mom's friend." Liam seemed to accept this answer, though he kept a wary eye on Ethan. Grace watched the interaction closely, her heart a mix of nerves and something she couldn't quite name. To her surprise, Ethan proved to be surprisingly good with Liam. He listened intently as Liam talked about his favorite superheroes, even engaging in a pretend sword fight with sticks they found in the park. For the first time, Grace saw a side of Ethan she hadn't expected, a playful, compassionate side that he had kept hidden. As the evening went on, Grace couldn't help but notice the way Ethan looked at Liam, not with pity or detachment, but with genuine admiration. "He's a great kid," Ethan said quietly as Liam ran ahead to the swings. Grace nodded, her voice soft. "Yes. He's my reason for everything." Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I can see that. And I can see where he gets his strength from." Grace didn't respond, but something in her chest tightened. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was more to Ethan than she had given him credit for. As the weeks went on, Ethan and Grace's interactions became less about the arrangement and more about genuine connection. They found themselves sharing more stories, fears, hopes, building an unspoken bond that neither of them had anticipated. For Ethan, Grace represented everything he had been missing, a sense of purpose beyond himself, a reminder of what truly mattered. And for Grace, Ethan was no longer just the cold, calculating businessman she had agreed to help. He was someone who, despite his flaws, was trying to change. One evening, as they sat on Grace's stoop after another meeting, Ethan turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply. Grace frowned, confused. "For what?" "For letting me in," he replied. "Even when I didn't deserve it." Grace studied him, her defenses wavering. "Don't thank me yet, Weston. I'm still trying to figure out if you're worth the trouble." Ethan laughed softly, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "I intend to prove that I am." For the first time in a long time, Grace felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Ethan Weston had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to assess their motives and predict their actions. But Grace Harper was different. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how little he truly knew about her. It started with small inconsistencies. The way her expression would harden at the mention of her past. The way she avoided certain questions about her son's father or her life before they met. At first, Ethan brushed it off. Everyone had their secrets. But as their connection deepened, so did his curiosity. One evening, Ethan decided to visit the diner where Grace worked. It wasn't part of their arrangement, but something compelled him to see her in her world, a place where she wasn't playing a role or pretending to be someone she wasn't. When he walked in, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of quiet conversation greeted him. Grace was behind the counter, pouring coffee for a customer. She didn't see him at first, but when her eyes met his, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Ethan," she said, setting down the coffee pot. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Just thought I'd stop by. See where you spend your time when you're not putting up with me." Grace rolled her eyes, though a small smile tugged at her lips. Well, here it is. Glamorous, isn't it? Ethan glanced around, taking in the worn booths and the faint hum of an old jukebox. It has character, he said diplomatically. Before Grace could respond, a man approached the counter, his expression tense. He was older, with a rough demeanor that immediately put Ethan on edge. "Grace," the man said, his tone curt. "We need to talk." Grace's smile vanished, replaced by a guarded look Ethan hadn't seen before. "Not now, Mark," she replied, her voice low but firm. Mark's gaze shifted to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. "Who's this? Another one of your projects?" Ethan straightened, his jaw tightening. "I'm her friend," he said evenly. "And who are you?" Mark ignored the question, his focus still on Grace. "You think you can keep running from the past? It doesn't work that way." Grace's hands clenched into fists, but she remained composed. "I'm not doing this here," she said quietly. "Leave, Mark." Mark stared at her for a moment longer before letting out a bitter laugh. "You can pretend all you want, Grace, but you know the truth always catches up with you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Ethan waited until they were outside the diner, away from curious eyes, before he spoke. "Who was that?" Grace avoided his gaze, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "No one important." "Grace," Ethan said, his voice firm but not unkind. "That didn't look like no one important. He knows you, and he knows something you're not telling me." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's complicated, Ethan." "Then explain it to me," he pressed. "I'm not going to judge you, but I can't help you if you keep shutting me out." For a moment, Grace seemed on the verge of opening up, but then she shook her head. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Try me," Ethan said, his gaze steady. Grace hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect herself and the growing trust she felt toward Ethan. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Marcus was Liam's father," Grace said, her voice tight. "He walked out on us before Liam was born. I thought I was done with him, but he's been showing up lately, making demands." Ethan's expression darkened. "Demands for what?" "Money," Grace replied bitterly. "He's in debt, and he thinks I owe him something. He's been threatening to take Liam away if I don't give him what he wants." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his anger barely contained. "That's blackmail. He has no right." "I know," Grace interrupted, her voice rising. "But I don't have the resources to fight him. He knows that." Ethan took a step closer, his tone softening. "Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped." Grace met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and defiance. "Because it's not your problem, Ethan. I've spent my whole life dealing with people who think they can fix things for me. I don't need saving, I need to handle this my way." Ethan nodded slowly, respecting her resolve. "I get that. But Grace, you're not alone in this anymore. Let me support you, on your terms." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. For the first time, Grace let Ethan see the full weight of the struggles she carried, and Ethan began to understand the depth of her resilience. Over the next few days, Ethan quietly started making arrangements. He hired a lawyer to look into Grace's rights and ensure that Mark couldn't make good on his threats. He didn't tell Grace immediately, knowing she wouldn't accept help outright, but he was determined to protect her and Liam in any way he could. Meanwhile, Grace began to see Ethan in a new light. He wasn't just the arrogant businessman she had agreed to help. He was someone who, despite his flaws, was willing to stand by her when it mattered most. One evening, as they sat in Grace's small living room while Liam slept in the next room, Ethan broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Dangerous habit," Grace teased, though her smile was faint. Ethan chuckled softly. "I've been thinking about how much I've been missing." Grace frowned, unsure of where he was going. What do you mean? All my life, I've been focused on the next deal, the next success, Ethan explained. But being with you and Liam, seeing how you fight for what matters, it's made me realize how shallow my life has been. Grace looked away, her expression unreadable. Don't romanticize it, Ethan. My life isn't some inspirational story. It's messy and it's hard. That's what makes it real, Ethan replied. And for the first time, I want something real. Grace met his gaze, her walls beginning to crack. You're not as shallow as I thought, Weston. Ethan smiled, a rare, genuine smile. Don't let that get around. I have a reputation to maintain. Grace laughed softly, the tension between them easing. For the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward, together. The revelations about Grace's struggles and Mark's threats had left a weighty silence hanging between her and Ethan. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt an overwhelming need to step outside his controlled, calculated world and fight for something, or someone, that truly mattered. For Grace, letting Ethan into the most vulnerable parts of her life was terrifying, but she couldn't deny the quiet comfort his presence brought. Ethan wasn't the type to sit idly by. The morning after their conversation, he made a decision. He would help Grace in any way he could, even if she resisted. He reached out to his legal team, ensuring everything was in place to protect Grace and Liam from Mark's baseless claims. He also began pulling strings to resolve Mark's financial troubles discreetly. Grace, however, was unaware of Ethan's behind-the-scenes efforts. She was too busy trying to maintain her own sense of control, determined to confront Mark on her terms. You don't have to do this alone, Ethan said one evening as they sat in her tiny kitchen, sharing a quiet meal. I've been doing it alone for years, Grace replied, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intent. Maybe it's time to stop. Grace met his eyes, her defenses softening. But before she could respond, Liam ran into the room, holding a drawing he'd made. Look, Mom, Liam said excitedly, holding up a colorful picture of himself, Grace, and, much to Grace's surprise, Ethan. Ethan took the drawing with a warm smile. This is incredible, buddy. You made me look way cooler than I actually am. Liam beamed, and for a brief moment, Grace felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, hope. Hope, however, was short-lived. Mark showed up unannounced at Grace's apartment one evening, his demeanor more aggressive than before. Ethan happened to be there, and the confrontation that followed was a tipping point. You're trespassing, Ethan said coldly, stepping between Mark and Grace. Mark sneered. And who are you? Her latest knight in shining armor? Let me guess, you're trying to buy her affection, just like everyone else? Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. Leave or I'll call the police. Mark laughed bitterly. You think you can scare me? I have rights, you know. Liam's my son, and I can take him whenever I want. Grace's face paled, but Ethan didn't waver. No, you can't. And if you even try, you'll have an army of lawyers on you faster than you can blink. Mark hesitated, realizing he was outmatched. After a few tense moments, he muttered something under his breath and stormed out. As the door slammed shut, Grace sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I can't keep doing this, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan crouched beside her, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to. I told you, Grace, you're not alone anymore. That night marked a turning point for Grace. For so long, she had carried the weight of her struggles alone, refusing to let anyone in. But Ethan's unwavering support and calm strength were breaking through her walls. The following day, she surprised Ethan by showing up at his office. He looked up from his desk, startled to see her. Grace, he said, standing. What's going on? I need to talk to you, she said, her tone serious. Ethan gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed. I've been thinking about everything you've done for me, for Liam, and I need to say something. Ethan's heart pounded. He wasn't sure what she was about to say, but he braced himself. I'm not used to this, she began. Letting someone else help me. Trusting someone to stick around. It's scary, Ethan. But you've shown me that not everyone leaves when things get hard. I don't know how to thank you. Ethan stepped closer, his voice gentle. You don't have to thank me, Grace. I'm not doing this for gratitude. I'm doing it because I care about you. About Liam. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or exhaustion, they were tears of relief. To show her appreciation, Grace invited Ethan over for dinner that weekend. It was a simple meal, nothing like the lavish events Ethan was used to, but it was one of the most meaningful evenings he'd ever had. Liam was ecstatic, showing Ethan all his drawings and toys, while Grace watched from the kitchen, a soft smile on her face. For the first time in years, her apartment felt warm, filled with laughter and a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. As the evening wound down, Ethan helped Liam into bed, reading him a story about a brave knight who protected his kingdom. When Liam drifted off to sleep, Ethan returned to the living room to find Grace waiting for him. Thank you, she said softly. For what? Ethan asked, taking a seat beside her. For being here, Grace replied. For caring about us. It means more than you know. Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand. You and Liam are worth it. For a moment, they sat in silence, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. The next few weeks saw a shift in their relationship. What had started as a business arrangement had blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated. A partnership built on trust, respect, and the possibility of something more. Ethan began spending more time with Grace and Liam, not as a benefactor or a savior, but as someone who genuinely wanted to be part of their lives. And Grace, for the first time, allowed herself to believe that she didn't have to face the world alone. One evening, as they sat on a bench at the park where they had first shared their stories, Ethan turned to Grace, his expression serious yet hopeful. I've been thinking about us, he began. Grace raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. And I don't want this to be temporary, he said, his voice steady. I want to be here, for you, for Liam, for as long as you'll let me. Grace's heart raced. She had spent so long building walls to protect herself, but Ethan had found a way through them. Are you sure? She asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. I've never been more sure of anything. Tears filled Grace's eyes as she smiled, the weight of her past finally beginning to lift. Then yes, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. As Ethan pulled her into an embrace, the world seemed to fade away. For the first time, they both felt something they had thought was impossible. Hope for a brighter future, together. Ethan Weston had always believed life was about winning, about chasing success and controlling outcomes. But sitting in Grace's modest living room, watching Liam proudly show off a school project while Grace laughed softly in the background, he realized he had been wrong. Life wasn't about control or perfection. It was about moments like this, unpolished, unexpected, and undeniably real. In the weeks following Ethan's heartfelt confession at the park, his and Grace's lives began to intertwine in ways neither of them had expected. Ethan's once rigid schedule, filled with board meetings and business deals, now included quiet dinners at Grace's apartment, park outings with Liam, and even grocery runs that made him feel oddly grounded. For Grace, the change was equally profound. She had spent so many years shielding herself from others, relying on no one but herself. Allowing Ethan into her life, and Liam's, felt like stepping into uncharted territory. But Ethan's consistency and genuine care slowly eased her fears. Ethan wasn't just there for the good days. He showed up for the hard ones too. When Liam caught a nasty flu, Ethan spent the night on Grace's couch, running to the pharmacy and keeping Liam entertained with stories about his own childhood misadventures. Grace watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper, something she was finally ready to name. But their newfound happiness wasn't without its challenges. Mark's threats lingered in the background, a reminder of the unresolved tension in Grace's life. Ethan, with his characteristic determination, took matters into his own hands. One afternoon, he approached Grace with a stack of papers in hand. "I've spoken to a lawyer," he said, his tone calm but firm. Grace frowned, her instincts bristling at the mention of lawyers. "Ethan, I told you." "I know," he interrupted gently. "I know you don't want me fighting your battles for you. But this isn't just about you, Grace. It's about Liam. These papers will ensure that Mark can't come near him again. It's your choice, but I think it's worth considering." Grace took the papers hesitantly, her emotions swirling. She had spent years fighting to protect Liam on her own, but now, for the first time, she realized she didn't have to. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here for you, for both of you." With the legal situation resolved, Grace began to feel a new sense of security she hadn't known in years. She started to let go of the constant worry that had defined her life for so long. Ethan's presence was no longer a source of uncertainty, it was a source of strength. One evening, as they sat together on her small couch after Liam had gone to bed, Grace turned to Ethan. "You've changed my life, you know." Ethan smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "No, Grace. You've changed mine." She frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I spent so many years chasing things that didn't matter," he admitted. "Money, power, status, they all felt so important. But then I met you, and I realized how empty my life was. You and Liam, you've shown me what really matters." Grace's heart ached at his words, but in the best way. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We're not perfect, Ethan. I'm not perfect." "Neither am I," he replied, his gaze steady. "But maybe that's why this works." Their relationship continued to grow, not without its challenges but stronger with each passing day. Ethan started to include Grace and Liam in more aspects of his life, introducing them to his closest friends and even bringing them to his company's family events. Grace, in turn, found herself leaning into the partnership more fully. She let Ethan help her with Liam's school projects, shared her dreams of opening her own small business someday, and even allowed herself to imagine a future where they were a family, not just in name, but in every sense of the word. One weekend, Ethan surprised them with a day trip to the countryside. They spent the day exploring, laughing, and creating memories that felt like something out of a storybook. For Grace, it was a reminder that happiness didn't have to be fleeting. It could be something she chose to hold on to. On a quiet evening as they walked home from the park, Ethan suddenly stopped. Grace, holding Liam's hand, turned to him with a curious look. "What's wrong?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Grace," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't plan for any of this. I didn't expect to meet someone like you or to care this much about you and Liam. But now, I can't imagine my life without you. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. And I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she stared at him, her heart pounding. "I don't have all the answers," Ethan continued. "But I know one thing, I love you, Grace. And I love Liam. Will you let me be a part of your life? For real this time?" Grace knelt down beside him, pulling Liam into a hug as she nodded through her tears. "Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times, yes." Liam, sensing the joy in the moment, cheered, "Does this mean Ethan's my dad now?" Grace laughed through her tears, kissing her son's forehead. "It means we're a family." Their journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. But as they walked home that night, hand in hand, Grace, Ethan, and Liam knew they had found something worth holding on to. They had built a life together, not perfect, but real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Would you have trusted Ethan after everything? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.